Bedtime Story. Chapter 1. The First Drop of Fire. The story of bourbon doesn't begin with a distillery. It doesn't begin with a man named Beam, or a preacher named Elijah, or a county line stamped on a tax map. It begins with heat, the kind of heat that rises from the earth after a storm and hangs under the canopy of the bluegrass like a whisper. The kind of heat that wakes up the sweetness in corn long before anyone knew what those kernels could become. Because bourbon, real bourbon, the good stuff that coats a glass and clings to a story, wasn't invented. It grew, not in a field, but in a feeling. But to understand that, you have to start before Kentucky even had a name worth defending. You have to go back to when settlers first crossed the Alleghenies with wagons that groaned under the weight of iron pots, seed sacks, and the stubborn belief that the land ahead held something better. These people weren't looking for bourbon. They were looking for survival. Corn, though, that they understood. The corn frontier. Corn was cheap. Corn grew where wheat threw a tantrum. Corn didn't care about soil the way barley demanded. Corn was the immigrant's blessing, a crop that fed you, your animals, and your neighbors, if they were friendly enough to deserve it. By the mid-1700s, corn had already claimed the loyalty of frontier farmers. It was hearty, American, and abundant. So abundant that the stuff began piling up faster than families could eat it, mill it, or stuff it into cornbread. And that left a problem. Corn spoiled. Corn molded. Corn took up precious space in wagons and storage sheds. But corn, when heated, mashed, and coaxed, had another destiny. The Scots-Irish, Germans, and English farmers who settled the frontier weren't just farmers. They were descendants of moonshiners and ale brewers, whiskey makers, and brandy distillers. Their families had been turning grain into gold since before they left the old country. So when the corn piled up, they didn't panic. They reached for the still. The logic was simple. 100 pounds of corn became far easier to store once you convinced it to drip out the end of a copper pot. Grain became spirit. Spirit became money. And whiskey became the first frontier banking system. You didn't trust a man's handshake out here, you trusted his barrel. The land where bourbon was waiting. When settlers finally reached what would become Kentucky, they found something rare. Limestone water so pure it made grain sing. Underground rivers filtered through ancient rock beds, stripping iron away and gifting the liquid with calcium that yeast adored. The water alone didn't make bourbon, but it made bourbon possible. Rivers crisscrossed the land like veins. Forests held oak so dense and sweet that the inside of a charred barrel smelled like a promise. Wildlife thrived. Winters were cold enough to let whiskey rest. Summers were hot enough to wake it back up. To a distiller, whether intentional or accidental, Kentucky was a cathedral. And among the first to walk into that cathedral were the men who would unknowingly set the stage for bourbon's birth. Not legends, not icons, just farmers with a thirst, a little copper, and no idea that their evening hobby would become America's spirit. The humble mash. A mash in the late 1700s wasn't measured by hydrometers or scaled with precision. You didn't find men calibrating pH levels or discussing ester profiles. You found a farmer stirring a wooden paddle in a steaming vat, hoping the mash turned sweet instead of sour, and that the yeast he carried from the last batch hadn't died during the trip. There were no recipes, only instincts. A handful of cracked corn, a scoop of leftover rye, a bit of malt if you could afford it, and water pulled from a spring so cold it bit the skin. From this rough chaos came something familiar but not yet defined. Early whiskey tasted more like the rough edges of the frontier than the caramel-laced bourbon we know today. The birth of the barrel. The decision to age whiskey wasn't an act of genius. It was an act of necessity. People didn't age whiskey because they wanted flavor. They aged it because glass was expensive, metal rusted, and stoneware broke. Barrels were cheap. Barrels were American. Barrels could ride on flatboats down the Ohio River to New Orleans, where whiskey sold better than corn ever had. It was during those long floats days, turning into weeks under a southern sun, that the magic happened. Whiskey entered the barrel clear and restless. It emerged darker, sweeter, oak-kissed, and deeper than anyone expected. Passengers tasted it, blinked hard, then tasted it again. What in God's name happened to this, they wondered. What happened was transformation. What happened was bourbon. They didn't have a name for it yet, but they knew they liked it. A spirit finds its identity. The river traders wanted more. The flatboat men wanted more. The farmers who couldn't sell corn but could sell aged whiskey wanted much more. And so an American whiskey style was born, not because someone invented it, but because the land itself insisted on it. Everything that makes bourbon, charred oak, sweet corn, stubborn ingenuity, it all existed long before the first distillery filed its paperwork. Bourbon wasn't the creation of a man. It was the creation of a place. A new name for an old drink. Somewhere along the river trade routes, between Kentucky and New Orleans, the word bourbon began appearing on barrels. Maybe it referred to Bourbon County, maybe to Bourbon Street, maybe to the old Bourbon region of Virginia. The truth is, bourbon got its name the same way it got its flavor, accidentally, and better than anyone expected. What mattered wasn't the accuracy. What mattered was the reputation. Barrels marked Old Bourbon were prized. They were darker. They were smoother. They were worth more in coin, barter, or goodwill. And so the farmers in Kentucky, simple men with calloused hands and stubborn pride, began striving for that flavor. Not scientifically, not methodically, but faithfully. They aimed for the taste that travelers craved, and with each passing batch, they got closer. Fire, faith, and frontier whiskey. By the late 1700s, early bourbon had become something more than just a drink. It was the quiet companion at barn raisings, the currency of peace between neighbors, the comfort during long winters, and the wild heartbeat of celebrations. It was fire in a glass, warmth you could hold, hope that didn't spoil. Children grew up watching fathers and grandfathers tend to stills like they were tending to family. The process was messy, unpredictable, sometimes illegal but always meaningful. And slowly, the families that would one day build empires began planting their roots. Families with names like Beam, Brown, Taylor, Weller, Samuels, and Willett. They didn't know it yet. They couldn't. History doesn't tap you on the shoulder while it's happening. But every drop they distilled was the foundation stone of an industry that would outlive wars, depressions, fires, and the kind of government regulations that would choke a lesser craft out of existence. Chapter 2. The families who lit the first fires. If Chapter 1 was about the land, the limestone, the corn, the flatboats drifting down the Ohio like wooden prayers, then Chapter 2 is about the people. The ones who stepped into that cathedral of Kentucky water and oak and said, "Let's try something." You can't talk about bourbon without talking about families, not distilleries' families. Because before these names were brands, they were just people carving a life out of timber, grain, and stubbornness. The names that fill our shelves today were once nothing more than signatures crouched on the corner of tax documents or scribbled on the inside of a barn ledger. And yet, from those pencil scratches unfurled dynasties: Beam, Taylor, Samuels, Weller, Willett, Brown, Pepper. They didn't set out to create legacies. They set out to feed families, survive winters, and build something worth inheriting. And maybe to make a whiskey worth pouring for neighbors who worked just as hard. Let's walk through the door where the story truly begins. Not with polished rickhouses, but with smoke, sweat, and the soft glow of copper. Intellided, the Beams, the quiet architects. Before Jim Beam was a brand, it was a bloodline. The story starts with Johann Jakob Beam, a German immigrant who arrived in America with a head full of whiskey knowledge and hands that knew the feel of grain. He Americanized his name to Jacob Beam, planted corn, and built a small still near the Kentucky frontier. He wasn't trying to become the first family of bourbon. He was trying to be a good farmer. But Beam had the distiller's itch, the instinct that pulls a man toward boiling mash the way fire pulls sap from pine. So sometime around 1795, he sold his first barrel of Old Jake Beam's Whiskey. Simple name. Simple mash bill. No age statement. No marketing team. No embossed bottle. Just honest whiskey from honest land. The Beam men learned whiskey the way other families learned carpentry or blacksmithing, passed down at the dinner table, then proved in the stillhouse. Every generation added something. David Beam expanded production. David M. Beam moved operations when the railroad came through. Colonel James Beauregard Beam, Jim Beam, rebuilt from ashes after Prohibition wiped the industry clean. Later generations refined, scaled, experimented, adapted. The Beams weren't flashy. They were foundational, quiet architects of consistency. Even today, Beam blood touches dozens of distilleries: Heaven Hill, Maker's Mark, Four Roses, Barton, because the craft was never just a business to them. It was a calling. And though bourbon has changed 1,000 ways since Old Jake's day, one truth still holds. You can't tell the story of bourbon without a Beam standing somewhere in the frame. Minus the Samuels family fire, failure, and reinvention. If the Beam legacy is a straight, sturdy line, the Samuels lineage is a wild river, rapid, unpredictable, but always flowing towards something sweeter. Their story begins with T.W. Samuels, a man with a knack for distilling and a temperament that matched a high rye mash. Spicy, driven, stubborn enough to build a distillery where others saw only trouble. His early operation succeeded, then failed, then succeeded again, a pattern that would define the family for generations. But the legend truly ignites with Bill Samuels Sr., who did something almost unheard of in bourbon. He threw away a family recipe, literally, burned it in the fireplace, pages curling like autumn leaves as his wife Margie watched. Too harsh, he said, too fiery. He wanted a softer whiskey, a gentle one, a front porch sipper that made friends instead of enemies. Margie, meanwhile, wasn't just a bystander. She reinvented the visual language of bourbon. The red wax? Her idea. The square bottle? Also her. The name Maker's Mark? Hers again. The star and SIV logo? A tribute to the fourth-generation Samuels. One family, two geniuses. One in the still room, one in the story. The Samuels didn't just make bourbon. They branded bourbon for the modern world without sacrificing soul. Their contribution wasn't volume or scale. It was identity. They made bourbon look as beautiful as it tasted. Eidsend, the Weller lineage, the innovators of sweetness. If bourbon had a poet, it might have been William LaRue Weller, not because he wrote stories, but because he understood something other distillers didn't: the poetry of a mash bill. In a time when rye was king, sharp, peppery, untamed, Weller made an unexpected move. He replaced rye with wheat. Wheat, a grain more associated with bread than boldness. Other distillers scoffed. Customers hesitated. The world wasn't ready for softness. But Weller believed in what wheat could do: bring sweetness, warmth, and long finishes without heat. He printed "honest whiskey" on his labels, a bold move at a time when rectifiers were pumping out colored poison and calling it whiskey. Weller was clean, reliable, and strangely modern. And then one day, a young man named Julian P. Pappy Van Winkle Sr. walked into the operation. You know how this story ends. Weller plus Van Winkle is the bourbon equivalent of Lennon plus McCartney. Together, they shaped an entire flavor profile, one that would one day become the most sought-after bourbon style in the world. You can trace every bottle of Pappy, Weller, Larceny, Old Fitz, and even many private barrels back to this single decision: replace the spice with sweetness. Let wheat do the talking. That, the Taylor legacy, the father of modern distilling. If Weller was the poet and the Beams were the builders, then Colonel Edmund Haynes Taylor Jr. was the politician, the man who dragged bourbon into legitimacy. E.H. Taylor didn't just make whiskey. He campaigned for it. He demanded cleanliness in a time when rat-infested distilleries dumped who knows what into the mash. He demanded honesty when rectifiers diluted whiskey with tobacco juice and turpentine. He demanded craftsmanship when others slapped labels on shortcuts. Taylor built Old Taylor Distillery, the first true show distillery, a castle dedicated to bourbon, a temple of copper, limestone, and Victorian pride. But his greatest achievement wasn't architectural, it was legislative. He led the charge for the Bottled-in Bond Act of 1897, the first consumer protection law in American history, predating food safety regulations by nearly a decade. Think about that. Before the government cared about milk, or bread, or medicine, they cared about bourbon, because Taylor made them care. He knew that if bourbon was to survive, it needed rules, integrity, transparency. Every bottle of bonded whiskey today is stamped with his ghost. And comment. The Brown family, the first giant. While many early distillers were content with local fame and regional distribution, George Garvin Brown thought bigger. When he founded what would become Brown-Forman, he didn't want whiskey that was good for its price or for locals. He wanted something consistent, a bottled product that tasted the same anywhere a man bought it. This was revolutionary. In the 1800s, whiskey was sold by the barrel, and what came out of one might taste wildly different from another. So George Brown did something bold. He bottled it himself. Old Forester became the first sealed, labeled, consistently batched bourbon sold in the United States. Doctors endorsed it. Pharmacists stocked it. Customers trusted it. The Brown family didn't just succeed, they scaled. They built systems. They embraced business in a way no one else had yet dared. And with that came brands like Old Forester, Woodford Reserve, Early Times, and later Jack Daniel's. Yes, it's Tennessee whiskey, but Brown-Forman's stewardship shaped both industries. The Browns were the first to prove bourbon could be both a craft and an empire. The Savaria, the Willets, the Kept Flame. Among the loud names of bourbon's past stands one quieter, humbler lineage, the Willets. Their story is not about size, not about political influence, not about dominating shelves. Their story is about preservation. The Willett family distilled on and off for generations, building a legacy not through power, but through endurance, resilience, and an unshakable faith in craft. By the mid-20th century, when bourbon nearly died in the shadow of vodka and clear spirits, many distilleries shuttered. Willett paused too, but they didn't disappear. They waited. They watched. They planned, and when the bourbon renaissance finally arrived, the Willets rose again not as a relic, but as a modern powerhouse of innovation and character. Today, their rickhouse top silhouettes are iconic, and their distillate is among the most respected in the industry. Willett represents the soul of bourbon, small, stubborn, and impossibly proud. I know. The Pepper dynasty, the unheralded royalty. James E. Pepper was bourbon's original showman. He dressed sharp, spoke loudly, and marketed his whiskey with a flair that would make modern influencers blush. He championed the old-fashioned cocktail, traveled with racehorses, and called his whiskey the oldest and best brand of whiskey made in Kentucky. But the Pepper family's real contribution was structural. They expanded distribution before others even imagined the scale. They hired the best distillers. They pushed boundaries. And then, almost as quickly, the dynasty vanished, swallowed by prohibition and shifting markets. For decades, the Pepper name was a ghost. Then, in the 21st century, a revival brought the name back, with distillation once again taking place in the same historic building where Pepper's crews once fired stills. History isn't always linear. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it circles back. Wenteded, threads that bind the families. Though each family had a distinct voice, all of them shared the same language. Land, grain, copper, water, patience. And though their paths intersected and diverged, overlapped and competed, they ultimately built the foundation of bourbon's future. What they gave us was more than distilleries, more than brands, more than bottles that now trade for absurd sums on secondary markets. They gave us continuity. They gave us lineage. They gave us the story. The story of bourbon is the story of American families fighting nature, politics, and sometimes each other, but always returning to the still. Because the still was home, the still was inheritance, the still was identity. These families didn't know they were shaping history. They were just trying to make a living. But from their stubbornness emerged something timeless, a spirit that tastes like America's past, but drinks like its future. Chapter 3. Rise of the Rickhouse. When bourbon became an industry, by the time the 1800s shook off their early dust and settled into a new century of ambition, bourbon was no longer merely a frontier survival skill. It was becoming a craft, and that craft was slowly threading itself into the economic fabric of a growing nation. Steamboats carved new arteries through American commerce. Railroads stitched together states like seams in a well-worn coat. Factories hummed where forests once whispered. And in the middle of it all stood bourbon, stubbornly handmade, unmistakably local, and quietly preparing to become something far bigger than anyone expected. This era didn't belong to one family or one distillery. It belonged to transformation, a time when copper pots met early steam power, when log stillhouses gave way to brick industrial complexes, and when barrels began to move with purpose, not drift. It was during this chaotic century that bourbon found its identity, its infrastructure, and its early champions. So let's walk into that world, grain dust floating in the air, white oak stacked in yards, riverboats whistling in the distance, and see how bourbon turned from a frontier drink into an American industry. If you dis for the turning of the century, a nation hungry for spirit, America in the early 1800s was a country expanding faster than it could understand itself. Cities swelled, factories roared, immigrants arrived with dreams and patience worn thin, and the nation needed whiskey not just to drink, but to believe in, something proudly American, made by American hands, rooted in American soil. Whiskey had been a farm product, a side hustle, a kind of corn-born currency. But markets were changing. People didn't want random barrels anymore. They wanted consistency. They wanted trust. They wanted whiskey they recognized, not whiskey that depended on which farmer's wagon happened to be in town. And so, distillers began to formalize. Barns became distilleries. Lean toss became warehouses. Family recipes became documented mash bills. Barrels became brands. This was the moment when bourbon shifted from improvisation to intention. But intention needs infrastructure, and infrastructure needs visionaries. Luckily, bourbon had both. And the first real distilleries where family and industry collide. The Beams take on steam. By the mid-1800s, David Beam, Jacob's son, realized the family's old methods couldn't keep up with demand. Farm stills were simply too small, hand-dug fermenters too slow, distribution too limited. David expanded production not with ego, but with practicality. He embraced steam power early, allowing for more predictable distillation temperatures and larger capacities. The Beam operation began its slow climb from farm whiskey to recognizable brand. His son, David M. Beam, took it further. When the railroad stretched its iron limbs across Kentucky soil, he moved the entire operation closer to a railway line. That decision, equal parts risk and foresight, would shape the future of Beam whiskey. It meant barrels could travel faster. It meant the Beam name could reach cities. It meant consistency could finally be delivered, not just promised. And quietly, the Beams were becoming the backbone of American whiskey. And well, the Browns go full scale. While the Beams expanded production through necessity, George Garvin Brown expanded through ambition. Old Forester wasn't just another whiskey, it was bottled, sealed, and sold as a specific product long before the rest of the industry caught up. Brown's focus wasn't merely on distillation. It was on quality control, blending consistency, consumer confidence, branding as a form of trust. He built distribution networks that seemed reckless in scope for the era. City to city, state to state, a trail of identical bottles carrying identical whiskey, where most distillers still sold by the barrel with all the variability that implied Brown was selling a promise, and promises travel farther than barrels. Even and Hesprit, The Taylors build a temple. Colonel E. H. Taylor, Jr. saw bourbon not as a farm product or a business, but as a calling, something noble, something clean, something worth protecting. He built Old Taylor Distillery like a cathedral, vaulted architecture, grand courtyards, fine stonework, attention to detail so excessive it bordered on art. Visitors didn't walk into Old Taylor. They entered it. The grounds whispered of pride. The fermenters echoed with discipline. The brick foundations felt like permanence. This wasn't just a workplace. It was a statement. And the statement was simple. Bourbon is worth doing right. But Taylor was more than a builder. He was a fighter. And the greatest fight of his life was just beginning. Why? The battle for honesty rectifiers, fraud, and the bottled-in-bond war. As bourbon grew in popularity, unscrupulous imitators swarmed behind it. Rectifiers, bottlers who purchased raw or unfinished spirit, were cutting whiskey with prune juice, neutral grain spirits, tobacco juice, caramel coloring, acids, and, in some cases, chemicals that were outright dangerous. They would flavor it, bottle it, and sell it as whiskey. It was cheap. It was profitable. It was poisoning the reputation of the good distillers. E. H. Taylor, Jr. refused to let bourbon become a victim of its own success. He lobbied. He traveled. He testified. He rallied distillers. His campaign was a crusade for purity for whiskey, straight from one distillery in one distillation season, aged in government-bonded warehouses to prevent tampering. It took years of political brawling. It took alliances with other major families. It took public pressure. But in 1897, the Bottled-in-Bond Act passed, the first consumer protection law in the history of the United States. Before meatpacking, before medicines, before milk, America protected bourbon first. And with that protection came legitimacy, a foundation upon which a real industry could be built. And cannons, rivers, railroads, and the birth of the rickhouse. As quality stabilized and regulations took hold, a new question emerged. Where do you put all this whiskey while it ages? The answer was the rickhouse, born out of necessity, refined by ingenuity, perfected by time. Early rickhouses were simple barns. Later ones were multi-story wooden giants, built to move air and trap heat. They stacked barrels in ricks' wooden racks that allowed air to flow around each barrel like a patient breath. Summer expanded the whiskey. Winter contracted it. The seasons pushed and pulled the spirit through charred oak like a slow heartbeat. Some rickhouses became legends. Heaven Hills Warehouse C. Buffalo Trace's Warehouse H. Built by Blanton. The Old Taylor brick rickhouses, Willett's hilltop structures, each one a living ecosystem of temperature, humidity, and time. Bourbon was no longer accidental aging. It was intentional maturation. And as rickhouses rose, so did expectations. End quote. The Willets hold the line through change. While the major families expanded, innovated, and legislated, the Willett family stood like a quiet silhouette in the background. They distilled with consistency. They aged with patience. They blended with instinct. They adapted without losing identity. And while much of the industry surged toward large-scale operations, the Willets continued to distill in smaller, more intimate ways. Where others aimed for volume, the Willets aimed for character. Their quieter presence during this era preserved something essential, the soul of small-batch bourbon that would one day become its own renaissance. The bourbon boom of the late 1800s. By the end of the 19th century, Kentucky was home to more than 2,000 registered distilleries, a patchwork of family operations, industrial giants, local heroes, and doomed experiments. Bourbon traveled by wagon, flatboat, steamboat, rail, and, increasingly, in sealed bottles. Cities couldn't grow fast enough to keep up with demand, and so bourbon found itself in an unfamiliar position. It had become a national spirit, not a farm product, not a frontier commodity, not a local specialty, a real industry, with real brands, real marketing, real loyalties. The families had succeeded not just in building distilleries, but in building trust. But the world was about to change again. Drastically, violently, unexpectedly. And Bourbon, like the nation that created it, would soon face a test unlike any it had ever known. A test not of craftsmanship, but of survival. Chapter 4. The Storm Before the Silence. By the close of the 19th century, Bourbon stood tall. Rickhouses dotted the hillsides, like wooden monuments. Barrels rolled onto rail cars bound for cities that had never tasted true Kentucky sweetness. Bottled in bond labels shone with a kind of quiet pride. And the great families Beam, Brown, Samuels, Taylor, Weller, Willett, each held a stake in a booming American industry. But Bourbon had barely settled into its stride before the world began shifting beneath its feet. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It wasn't a catastrophic event. It wasn't even about whiskey at first. It was about morality or the appearance of it. It was about politics, religion, industrialization, and fear. It was about a nation struggling to define itself and choosing, for a moment, to blame its vices instead of its problems. The storm began gently enough, like a whisper stirred by a cold wind. But that whisper grew and grew until it became a voice that echoed through churches, town halls, newspapers, and eventually the halls of Congress. This chapter isn't just about the lead-up to Prohibition. It's about the forces that reshaped bourbon before the hammer ever fell. Clace, the rise of temperance, a war of ideas. Long before any laws changed, long before distilleries went quiet, America faced a new kind of enemy. The temperance movement, a rising tide of moral activism that saw alcohol as the root of all societal harm. For decades, bourbon had been a staple, served at weddings, traded in negotiations, used as medicine, poured at celebrations, and enjoyed daily by workers who trusted whiskey more than questionable water sources. But as industrialization spread, cities became overcrowded and dangerous. Saloon culture grew louder, rowdier, harder to ignore. Immigrant populations surged, bringing their own drinking traditions. And wages weren't keeping up with the cost of urban life. When people struggled, they blamed what they saw, and what they saw was drinking. Temperance groups seized the moment. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the Anti-Saloon League, painted dramatic portraits of drunkenness destroying families, corrupting men, and eroding American virtue. To them, bourbon wasn't a craft. It wasn't a cultural heritage. It wasn't an economic engine. It was the enemy. The irony, of course, was that bourbon had little to do with the saloon chaos. Most temperance outrage centered around cheap, unregulated urban alcohol, often imported or rectified, not distilled in Kentucky. But temperance didn't care about nuance. Temperance cared about targets. And bourbon stood tall enough to be seen. When the industrial world shifts the battleground. As bourbon was evolving from farm whiskey to industry, America was evolving from farm nation to industrial empire. Factories shaped lifestyles. Railroads reshaped geography. Cities reshaped culture. And industrialization brought a new kind of worker. Tired, underpaid, overworked, seeking escape. Saloons, often unregulated and fueled by rectified spirits, provided that escape but also amplified public concern. While Kentucky bourbon had rules and traditions, urban moonshine had none. Politicians, eager for votes, leaned into the temperance narrative. Newspapers printed stories of men who stumbled into debt, crime, or violence. Preachers delivered sermons condemning alcohol as a moral rot. Cities enacted local dry laws. Meanwhile, in Kentucky, distillers watched these headlines with caution. The industry had grown too big to ignore the shifting winds. In Free, the distillers respond unity through necessity. For the first time, bourbon families found themselves fighting, not competitors, but public opinion. Meetings were held. Alliances were formed. Trade organizations began to take shape. Old rivals stood side by side. Beam and Brown Hout, Taylor and Pepper, Weller and Willett. They understood that the next era wouldn't be won by who had the best mash bill, but by who survived the political war. And perhaps more than any other figure, E. H. Taylor Jr. stepped forward again. He had already fought the battle for integrity with the Bottled in Bond Act. He knew how to navigate the political storm. He knew how to talk to lawmakers. He believed in bourbon as an American legacy worth protecting. Taylor and other distilling leaders pushed for laws that distinguished pure Kentucky bourbon from cheap rectified spirits. Their argument was simple. Don't blame bourbon for the sins of saloons, but fighting perception is like fighting smoke. You can wave your hands all you want, but the room still fills. And the sea. Economic pressure, not all distilleries could adapt. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, bourbon's world was tightening. Regulations increased. Competition intensified. Temperance gained momentum. Local option laws began drying up counties one at a time. Banks became cautious about lending to distillers. Some small operations collapsed. Others were bought out or consolidated. Some families sold their interests entirely. A few went quiet and waited. Meanwhile, the larger distilleries, the Beams, Browns, and Taylors invested in modernization. Steam-powered stills, larger rickhouses, standardized bottling lines, cooperage improvements, partnerships with rail carriers. They grew not because they wanted to dominate, but because the era demanded survival through scale. What had once been a family business was becoming industrial. And industrial businesses are easier targets. End quote. The social battle spills into politics. Temperance groups didn't just preach. They organized. They strategized. They lobbied. Every election cycle, new laws appeared. Alcohol-free Sundays. Restrictions on saloon licenses. Local prohibition votes say. Increased taxes on distillers. Shipping restrictions on liquor bin. Kentucky itself became a battleground, a place where towns could be wet while the surrounding counties were bone dry. Distillers, who once worried only about mash bills, now worried about legislation. A distillery could go from profitable to illegal with a single vote. And the temperance movement kept gaining ground. The women's movement, progressivism, and the unity of causes. Here's the twist history often forgets. Temperance wasn't just about alcohol. It was woven into broader social causes. Women's suffrage, child welfare, labor rights, anti-corruption, public health. Alcohol became the face of everything reformers wanted to fix. If a man beat his wife, they blamed whiskey. If a family went into debt, they blamed whiskey. If a worker missed time, they blamed whiskey. If politics were corrupt, whiskey took the blame. If crime increased, whiskey took the blame. Never mind poverty, never mind working conditions, never mind the industrial pressures crushing immigrant families. Whiskey was the easy villain, and bourbon, being the most iconic American whiskey, was the biggest target. One height, the last golden years before the fall. From roughly 1,897 bottled in bond to around 1,910, bourbon entered a strange era. Growth under the shadow of doom. Rickhouses were full. Exports increased. Bottled brands proliferated. Distillers invested in infrastructure and advertising. Tourism, in its early form, began as visitors toured distilleries like Old Taylor and Old Crow. Bourbon was thriving, but everyone felt the tension. Distillers whispered about the coming troubles. Families debated whether to expand or hold. Some built more warehouses, hoping aging stock would one day save them. Others diversified into cordials, brandy, or medicinal spirits. In the countryside, you could taste the sweetness of growth. In the cities, you could smell the acrid fear of reform. Trains carrying barrels of bourbon passed through counties where not a single drink was legal. The contradiction was absurd. The danger was real. And then came 1,913, 1,917, 1,918. War, patriotism, anti-German sentiment, consolidation of grain for soldiers, prohibition arguments linking alcohol to national weakness. Distillers felt the walls closing in. Well, the families prepare, some with hope, others with resignation. The Beams, experienced, resilient, religiously practical, they stockpiled where possible, diversified where needed, and prepared to weather a storm. The Browns, global-minded, sophisticated, they invested heavily in medicinal whiskey positioning. The Samuels, tighter margins, smaller operations. They debated shutting down preemptively, a decision that would influence Maker's Mark decades later. The Taylors, Colonel Taylor died in 1923, but long before that, he warned the entire industry, government does not give without taking. And they have begun to take. His prophecy was already coming true. The Wellers and Van Winkles, better positioned than most, their wheated whiskey had gained a quiet but loyal following, particularly among medicinal distributors. The Willets, small, nimble, and deeply rooted in Kentucky soil. They trimmed operations but refused to abandon distillation entirely. The Peppers, once aristocracy of bourbon, they were already struggling under financial strain and political headwinds. Not all would survive the coming era. Not all would return. But bourbon, like the families who made it, was stubborn. The tension before Prohibition, when the future holds its breath. The years just before national prohibition were like the silence before a rickhouse fire. You can feel the heat rising. You hear wood crackling. You smell oak warming, but nothing has fully ignited. Yet, distillers sensed it, families sensed it, Kentucky sensed it, and then slowly at first, then rapidly counties voted dry. Shipments halted, licenses expired, banks pulled away, insurance rates skyrocketed, molasses plants, cooperages, and grain suppliers panicked. The entire ecosystem around bourbon began to fracture. But even then, bourbon was not dead. Not yet. It was gathering itself quietly, like a great beast curled in winter, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But first, it had to survive the darkness. Chapter 5. The 13-Year Winter. The American whiskey industry didn't collapse on a single day. It didn't fall the moment a law passed. It didn't die with a vote, or a speech, or a newspaper headline. It froze. Like a river in deep winter, bourbon didn't disappear. It went quiet, still, cold, waiting beneath ice that stretched across the entire country. Prohibition wasn't an event. It was a season, a long, bitter season of hunger, secrecy, luck, and survival. For 13 years, bourbon lived in shadows, basements, court offices, pharmacies, and behind the locked doors of rickhouses. Nobody dared enter without a federal agent holding the key. This is the story of that winter, the long hibernation where bourbon nearly died, yet somehow emerged stronger, wiser, and more legendary than before. Recordin, the day the barrels went dark. On the 16th of January, 1920, the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act took effect, making the production, sale, and transportation of intoxicating liquors illegal across the United States. People stood outside saloons the night before as bartenders poured final shots. Some cried, some laughed, some filled flasks with trembling hands. Some didn't believe the law would last more than a few weeks. But bourbon distillers knew better. They saw the storm long before it arrived. They had watched counties go dry, one by one. They had listened to sermons, headlines, and speeches. They had feared this moment, prepared for it, dreaded it. Yet when the law finally came, it still hit like a hammer. The rickhouses were suddenly still. The mash tubs were scrubbed and emptied. The copper stills cooled for the last time. The workers were sent home, and an uncomfortable silence settled across Kentucky, a silence that felt like grief. How the law strangled distilling. Prohibition didn't just ban the making of bourbon. It banned nearly everything connected to it. Distillation, transportation, bottling for consumption, sales, bar operations, most shipping, most storage, advertising, public endorsement. The government's stance was clear. Bourbon was the problem. But there was one loophole, a strange, narrow, ironic little loophole that would save the industry. Medicinal whiskey. Doctors could prescribe whiskey like medicine. Pharmacies could dispense it. Distilleries who obtained federal permits could bottle their existing stock. This single clause would become the lifeline that kept the heartbeat of bourbon faintly alive through the long winter. But who got the permits? Not many, and certainly not by luck. And stated MAPE, the 6 survivors who kept the flame alive. Only 6 distilleries were granted federal licenses to bottle medicinal whiskey during Prohibition. 1. Brown-Forman. 2. Stitzelweller. Then A. P.H. Stitzel. 3. Schenley. 4. Frankfurt Distillery. 5. Bernheim. 6. American Medicinal Spirits, part of National Distillers. Each license was a golden ticket, a passport through the dead season. And behind many of these permits were the very families we've been following. The Browns. Old Forester. George Garvin Brown's focus on bottled consistency paid off. Doctors trusted branded whiskey. Pharmacies stocked it. Regulators approved it. Brown-Forman survived. Julian Pappy Van Winkle and William LaRue Weller. Pappy, working with the Stitzel operation, secured a permit through relentless negotiation, political maneuvering, and the reputation of honest wheated whiskey. They didn't just survive, they thrived quietly. The Beams, they lost their own distilling operations, but their hands stayed busy. Beam family members became the go-to distillation experts for facilities bottling medicinal whiskey or producing legal industrial spirits. Beam blood distilled through the shadows. The Pepper lineage, the proud Pepper dynasty, once giants, could not secure a permit. Their distillery went cold. Their family legacy dimmed. It would take nearly a century to resurrect the Pepper name. The Samuels family, T.W. Samuels, closed shop before Prohibition hit, a decision born of exhaustion and foresight. This distilling silence would ultimately lead to the rebirth of the family craft. As makers mark decades later, the Willets, small and nimble, the Willets survived by distilling industrial alcohol, a legal exception for fuel, hospital disinfectants, and wartime supplies. Their true bourbon operations slept, but the family endured. 6 legal bottlers, thousands of illegal ones, and millions of thirsty Americans. The stage was set for one of the strangest eras in American history. And now, the pharmacies become the new saloons. During Prohibition, the place to get bourbon was your local drugstore. If America had Yelp reviews in the 1,920 seconds, every pharmacy in Kentucky would have 5 stars and a line out the door. The process was absurd. 1. You visited a doctor. 2. Complained of anxiety, back pain, influenza, or the classic diagnosis, nervousness. 3. The doctor scribbled a prescription. 4. You walked to the pharmacy. 5. You walked out with a pint of bourbon in a square labeled bottle. Some pharmacies grew wealthy. Some doctors bought new cars. Some patients became very, very healthy. Walgreens. Yes, that Walgreens exploded from 20 stores to 500 during Prohibition, thanks in no small part to medicinal whiskey. Every bottle came with government paperwork. Every pint was sealed with official tax stamps. This wasn't moonshining. This was bourbon's cold, bureaucratic lifeline. And trade. The black market where bourbon learned to be bold. Of course, not all whiskey during Prohibition came from pharmacies. Most didn't. There were 3 dark rivers of illegal liquor flowing through America. 1. Moonshiners in the hills, using makeshift stills, using corn when they had it, sugar when they didn't, making whiskey that could be great, or could blind you. 2. Rum runners at the coasts, smuggling Canadian, Caribbean, and Irish spirits into the country by the boatload. 3. Bourbon thieves raiding rickhouses. This part is rarely told, but it happened often. Rickhouses full of aging whiskey were a temptation. Guards were hired, barrels were branded, chained, hidden, or moved. Some were stolen by night, rolled down hills, loaded onto wagons, and sold to speakeasies. And while this illegal commerce wasn't noble, it did something important. It kept the taste of bourbon alive in the American memory. If Prohibition had fully erased bourbon from daily life, the spirit might have died culturally, not just legally. Instead, bourbon became something forbidden, something whispered about, something remembered, something missed. Nothing fuels desire like absence. Undirect. The rickhouses age in darkness. While people drank smuggled whiskey in medicinal pints, a more important transformation was happening quietly, behind locked doors. The bourbon aged. For the first time in history, barrels sat untouched for years, sometimes a decade or more. Families had no choice but to wait. And that waiting changed everything. Whiskey that would have been bottled at 2-4 years old pre-Prohibition was now aging for 8, 10, even 12 years in some cases. Distillers didn't know what they'd find at the end of the tunnel. But when Prohibition ended, they discovered something extraordinary. Older bourbon tasted better, much better. Prohibition accidentally created the concept of well-aged bourbon. End quote. Modern premium expressions, Pappy Weller Antique, Old Fitz decanters, Blanton Single Barrel, all owe something to this 13-year winter. Well, ours, the families that refused to quit. Prohibition was cruel to bourbon, but bourbon is a stubborn thing, and so are the people who make it. Let's walk through their worlds during this dark era. The Beams. Members of the Beam family worked at several legal industrial distilleries and medicinal bottling facilities. Their craft never died. It just moved, adapted, folded, and unfolded again. When the lights came back on in 1933, the Beam name would leap instantly back into prominence. The Browns. Brown Foreman bottled medicinal whiskey non-stop. They kept their workforce employed. They protected their barrels. They stayed solvent. When Prohibition ended, they were one of the few distillers ready to scale. The Wells and Van Winkle. Pappy thrived quietly. His wheated whiskey aged beautifully. His company expanded bottling capacity. He networked shrewdly with pharmacists and distributors. They emerged not just alive but strengthened. The Taylor lineage. Colonel E. H. Taylor Jr. died shortly after Prohibition began. His legacy of purity and regulation lived on, even as his own distillery faced enormous pressure. History would vindicate him, but too late for him to see it. The Willets. Working in industrial alcohol production, kept their equipment warm and their skills sharp. When bourbon returned, so did the Willets, not broken, but tempered. The Samuels. They waited, quietly, restlessly. And when Bill Samuels Sr. eventually revived the family dream with a new recipe, one literally burned into existence, he did so with lessons born from Prohibition's ashes. The Peppers. Their empire shattered, their name dimmed. But a spark would survive, hidden in old documents and forgotten warehouses, until new hands revived the Pepper brand a century later. Azur, the world without bourbon. This part is rarely talked about. Asterisk, asterisk. During Prohibition, bourbon didn't decline. America declined. Asterisk, asterisk. Crime surged. Organized syndicates grew powerful. Communities fractured. Government corruption soared. Poisoning from bad alcohol skyrocketed. Doctors and pharmacies became shadow saloons. Prohibition did not make America sober. It made America dishonest. And bourbon, real bourbon, became a ghost of what it once was. A memory, a myth, a flavor people couldn't quite forget. But the world was about to change again. The ice was melting. The long winter was ending. And bourbon, patient as always, was ready. In fact, it abode. The end of Prohibition, the first warm wind. On the 5th of December 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing Prohibition. Church bells rang. Bars reopened. Pharmacies quietly slipped their whiskey bottles back into the stockroom. Rickhouse doors creaked open for the first time in 13 years. Dusty barrels finally rolled into daylight. And when people tasted real, Kentucky-born bourbon again, something happened. They remembered. They remembered the warmth, the sweetness, the oak, the history, the identity. But the industry they returned to was not the one they had left. Some families were gone. Some distilleries were rubble. Some brands would never return. And yet, from the ashes of Prohibition, a new chapter was about to begin, one filled with rebuilding, rebirth, modernization, consolidation, innovation, and the seeds of the Bourbon Renaissance that would eventually sweep the world. The 13-year winter had ended. The spring would not be easy, but it would be glorious. Chapter 6. Rebuilding the Flame. Prohibition ended not with trumpets, but with exhalation. A long, weary, grateful exhalation, the kind a man lets out after holding his breath underwater longer than he thought he could. The day the 21st Amendment was ratified, the nation didn't celebrate as loudly as history books like to pretend. It simply breathed again. Bars unlocked their doors. Pharmacies cleaned out the medicinal section. Saloons wiped down counters dusty from 13 years of neglect. Families reopened windows they'd kept dark for a decade. And in Kentucky, a sound echoed through the hills that hadn't been heard in years. The roll of barrels. Rickhouse doors squeaked open, letting sunlight fall onto aging whiskey like a blessing. The smell that escaped oak, thyme, heat, sweetness, drifted into the world as if bourbon itself had been holding its breath. But what America didn't see was the truth. The bourbon industry was alive, but it was wounded. Distilleries were empty shells. Machinery was rusted. Warehouses were damaged by time and neglect. Master distillers had scattered to industrial alcohol plants, farms, odd jobs, or retirement. And bourbon, the great American spirit, had to learn to walk again. This chapter is about the rebuilding, the gritty, hopeful, painful rebirth of bourbon after Prohibition's long winter. Wace, the aftermath, a spirit without an industry. When the laws changed, thousands cheered. Distillers didn't. They worried. Because the world they stepped back into was not the world they'd left behind in 1920. 1. The economy was fragile. The Great Depression had crushed businesses. Money was tight. Banks were risk-averse. Investors were cautious. Restarting a distillery required new equipment, fresh grain, repairs, employees, legal inspections, months of production, years of aging before profit. Who in their right mind would invest in something that wouldn't produce income for 4, 6, 10 years? 2. Consumers had changed. A generation had grown up drinking bathtub gin, rum from the coasts, Canadian whiskey, moonshine, cheap whiskey blends from illicit sources. Their palates were different. Their expectations were different. Some weren't even sure what real bourbon tasted like. 3. Trust had to be rebuilt. Many Americans blamed alcohol for the nation's moral collapse, ironically ignoring the fact that Prohibition itself caused most of that collapse. In any case, distillers had to win back public confidence. 4. The workforce was gone. 13 years is a long time. Master distillers had aged. Younger workers had never learned the craft. Families had moved on. 5. The barrels had overaged. Some whiskey was magnificent. Some was ruined. All of it was a gamble. Bourbon needed not just time, it needed people, money, vision, and faith. And against all odds, the families rose. End quote. The first to stand, Brown-Forman. Brown-Forman had been bottling medicinal whiskey through the freeze, and they were one of the rare few ready to hit the ground running. As soon as Prohibition ended, they rehired workers as work, restarted bottling lines, invested in infrastructure, leaned hard into Old Forester's trusted name. In a world suspicious of whiskey, consistency was gold. Old Forester's promise, sealed, labeled, and unaltered, carried enormous weight. And behind that promise stood the same family, offering the same guarantee. You know what's in this bottle. That mattered more in 1934 than at any time before. And well, the return of the Beam's resurrection through bloodlines. The Beam family had spent Prohibition working wherever legal distilling happened, industrial alcohol plants, medicinal bottlers, even consulting roles. When the industry returned, the Beams became the most in-demand master distillers in America. Their hands hadn't forgotten. Their instincts hadn't rusted. Their lineage had stayed alive in secret, quiet ways. Jim Beam, Colonel James Beauregard Beam, rebuilt the family distillery in just 120 days, a feat nearly impossible, even with modern equipment. He was in his 72nd at the time, but when he stood in front of his new stillhouse, a shovel in one hand and a cigar in the other, he looked like a man 30 years younger. He wasn't just rebuilding a business. He was reclaiming a birthright, and the whiskey that flowed from that resurrected still would eventually become the largest bourbon brand in the world. But at the time, it was simply a family picking up the pieces. End. The Stitzel operation, the rise of Pappy. If every family emerged from Prohibition with scars, Julian Pappy Van Winkle came out with quiet strength. Pappy's operation, built on the foundation of A.P.H. Stitzel, had thrived as a medicinal bottler. His wheated bourbon aged magnificently during Prohibition. His warehouses were intact. His crew was skilled. His finances were stable. Most importantly, he had stock when nobody else had stock. While other distilleries spent years rebuilding, Stitzel's whiskey was ready. Pappy didn't waste the opportunity. He forged something new, a merger that created Stitzel Weller, one of the most legendary bourbon distilleries ever built. The doors opened in 1935 on Derby Day. Guests walked through an operation unlike anything in Kentucky. Brick buildings, tall rickhouses, clean fermentation rooms, a visionary focus on wheated mash bills. Pappy wasn't trying to rebuild bourbon. He was trying to elevate it, and he did. To Enever, the Willets, small but stubborn, the Willett family re-entered bourbon gradually, carefully, and with the humility of survivors. They rebuilt their distillery on a hill overlooking Bardstown, filling their first post-Prohibition barrel in 1937. Their operation was small-tiny compared to the powerhouses, but their whiskey was honest. Their focus wasn't scale, it was character. And while other families chased market share, the Willets built legacy. It would take decades for the world to notice, but the seeds were planted here, quietly, in the shadow of the giants. Endymion. The Samuels, a pausing of heritage. The Samuels family, exhausted by the industry and wary of the financial risks, did not immediately restart production. T.W. Samuels Distillery reopened briefly under new ownership, but the heart of the family stepped away. Bill Samuels Sr. would eventually return, but not yet. Not until a decade later. Not until a recipe was burned. Not until a new idea was born. History was saving something special for the Samuels line. But in the immediate years after Prohibition, they were quiet. 18 Exist. Pepper, the fall of a dynasty. No bourbon family suffered more from Prohibition than the Peppers. Once one of Kentucky's most flamboyant and successful dynasties, their distillery sat cold. Their brand fractured. Their finances collapsed. The name Pepper, once shouted in saloons and printed proudly on race banners, faded into obscurity. But the Pepper story wasn't over. Even in its fall, something survived: old papers, blueprints, flavor notes, surviving brick walls, waiting nearly a century for revival. But during the 1,930 seconds, the Pepper line was lost. In 2-3, the problem no one saw coming: blended whiskey. While bourbon was rebuilding, another spirit crept into America's changing palate: blended whiskey. Cheaper, lighter, more familiar to those raised on Prohibition-era substitutes. Brands like Seagram's pushed blends hard, with marketing campaigns that made bourbon look old-fashioned, harsh, rustic. Bourbon was darker, stronger, more complex, more expensive to make, slower to produce in. Blends were fast, inexpensive, easy to drink, aggressively advertised. The public, especially in big cities, flocked to them. Bourbon's post-Prohibition battle wasn't just rebuilding, it was relevance. But the families had something blends didn't: authenticity. And that authenticity would matter, eventually, but not yet. In Stixit, the government steps in again. After Prohibition, the government was eager to regulate alcohol tightly, perhaps overcorrecting after the wild lawlessness of the 1,920 seconds. Bourbon faced Strict labeling rules, new taxation systems, federal oversight meant changes to warehouse bonding periods, new definitions for straight whiskey, bourbon, and blended. Some distillers embraced the clarity. Others struggled under the weight of regulation. But these laws did something important. They protected bourbon from the fraud that had nearly destroyed it before Prohibition. Thanks to E. H. Taylor Jr.'s early crusade and the industry's insistence on purity, bourbon now stood on a foundation of integrity. The government had become its uneasy ally, strict, demanding, burdensome, but ultimately protective. End quote. The Great Slowdown, World War II. Just as bourbon was finding its footing, the world changed again. With the outbreak of World War II, the U.S. government requisitioned distilleries to produce industrial alcohol for rubber, explosives, medical supplies, aviation fuel additives. Mash bills were replaced with wartime formulas. Barrels stopped filling. Workers became soldiers. Distilleries ran day and night, producing alcohol for victory. A few distillers managed to keep limited whiskey production alive, but most shifted entirely to war-related output. This created a new problem. By the end of World War II, America faced a bourbon shortage. Soldiers returning home wanted whiskey, real American whiskey, and there simply wasn't enough. Many distilleries rushed to bottle whiskey before it was mature. Quality slipped. Some brands suffered, but in other ways, the war changed bourbon for the better. Industrial alcohol production, modernized equipment, wartime operations, streamlined distillery efficiency. Returning soldiers carried an appetite for bourbon into the 1,940 seconds. 50 seconds. Boom. Bourbon was battered, but alive. Always alive. And percent. The post-war years, the final golden era, from the late 1,940 seconds into the 1,950 seconds, bourbon enjoyed a renaissance. Soldiers developed a taste for whiskey abroad. Economic prosperity lifted all boats and wind. Suburban bars and home cocktails grew popular. Iconic brands like Old Grandad, Old Fitzgerald, Jim Beam, and Old Forester thrived. This was the last great era when bourbon reigned as America's favorite spirit. The rick houses were full. Distilleries were booming. Brands were expanding. Tourism increased. America drank bourbon proudly. But beneath the surface, a new shadow was forming. The next storm wouldn't be political. It wouldn't be moral. It wouldn't be war. It would be cultural. And it would nearly kill bourbon entirely. Because in the decades ahead, American taste would shift again, this time toward clear spirits, convenience, speed, and trends that threatened to bury the old families under dust and disinterest. But that story belongs to the next chapters. For now, bourbon is standing tall, again bruised, scarred, but triumphant. The flame had been rebuilt. It was time to see whether it could endure. Chapter 7. The Long Decline. Bourbon's Dark Age. The post-war bourbon boom sparkled like a glass raised in celebration, golden, warm, filled with optimism. Brands sold out. Rickhouses filled faster than they could be built. Distillers hired by the dozens. Cocktail culture was alive, earthy, American. This should have been bourbon's forever chapter. But history never lets anything stay sweet for long, because somewhere between the 1,950 seconds and the early 1,960 seconds, a quiet shift began. A small one, at first subtle as a bar towel, being folded at the end of a shift. A changing palate. A new generation. A cultural pivot. And bourbon, proud and stubborn, didn't see the warning signs. Or maybe it did, but refused to believe them. Either way, a darkness approached. A slow, unrelenting decline that would push bourbon to the edge of extinction. This is the story of that fall. The story of how bourbon went from the defining American spirit to something old men drank alone. A story of consolidation, neglect, cultural shifts, and near ruin. A story of empty rickhouses, forgotten brands, and barrels sold for pennies. but also, if you look closely, a story of survival. Because bourbon never truly dies. It waits. And in this dark age, it would wait with the patience of a spirit that knows its time will come again. Is time. The culture shifts. Clear spirits. Clear futures. The first blow didn't come from politics or economics. It came from fashion, from taste. America, in the 1,960 seconds, wanted modern, clean, fast, youthful, bright, European, trendy. They wanted Martinez Tass, vodka, gin bing, rum and cokes, light beer, white wine spritzers. The marketing was sleek. The bottles looked futuristic. The ads promised sophistication, not heritage. Suddenly, bourbon with its oak, its history, its heaviness felt like something your grandfather drank on the porch. Vodka, with its neutrality and mixability, seemed refreshing and new. Gin was exotic again. Rum was fun. Tequila was daring. Bourbon was old. And for the first time, old wasn't selling. If you died, the industry's mistake, chasing a trend, losing itself. Instead of doubling down on authenticity, many bourbon companies panicked. They changed recipes, shortened aging, introduced lighter blends, tried white whiskey experiments, even marketed bourbon as a cocktail mixer rather than a sipping spirit. In trying to be something it wasn't, bourbon lost what made it special. Meanwhile, vodka took over. Young drinkers didn't want complexity. They wanted no hangover, a lie. No smell, a myth. Smooth, meaning flavorless. Modern, meaning marketed heavily. Vodka exploded. Gin soared. Rum surged. Scotch whiskey grew among the elite. Japanese whiskey entered the conversation. And bourbon stalled. The rickhouses still held thousands of barrels. But nobody wanted the whiskey inside. The rickhouses go silent, an industry in freefall. Picture a rickhouse in 1974. Dust settling, air unmoving, barrels aging in the dark, waiting for a day that may never come. Distilleries filled fewer barrels each season. Then they stopped filling some warehouses entirely. Then whole rickhouses went dormant. The smell of evaporating whiskey, the angel's share, still hung in the air. But it was no longer a sign of production. It was a sign of neglect. Distilleries closed. Historic ones. Iconic ones. Ones with names you'd recognize today if they had survived long enough to matter. Workers were laid off. Generations of distillers, men whose fathers and grandfathers and great-grandfathers had distilled, found themselves standing outside locked gates. Warehouses were abandoned, windows broken, roofs sagging, barrels leaking into dirt floors. Brands died quietly. Old names, respected names, labels that once commanded respect in saloons and supper clubs simply disappeared. Prices plummeted. A 10-year bourbon? You couldn't give it away. A 15-year? The market didn't exist. A 20-year? Why would anyone age whiskey that long when nobody was drinking it? The irony is sharp. The bottles people fight for today, the well-aged masterpieces of the 70 seconds and 80 seconds, existed only because nobody wanted them at the time. An evil, consolidation, the survival of the fewest. As demand fell, the bourbon world shrank. Companies merged. Corporations bought struggling brands. Overseas conglomerates stepped in as American investors stepped away. Distilleries that once competed now shared ownership. A few giants emerged. Beam, Brown-Forman Lord, Heaven Hill, Shenley, National Distillers, later acquired by Beam. United Distillers, successor to Stitzel Weller. Wild Turkey, then under Austin Nichols. Smaller distilleries either. It's closed, sold their brands out, shifted to industrial alcohol, or waited, barely alive. This consolidation wasn't elegant. It was survival. Barely. When the frat, the fall of Stitzelweller, the end of an era. Of all the tragedies of bourbon's dark age, none hit harder than the fall of Stitzelweller, the home of Pappy Van Winkle's wheated bourbon. Pappy himself had passed away in 1965. Without his leadership, corporate interests took hold. The distillery was eventually sold to conglomerates more interested in vodka and blended whiskey than long-aged bourbon. In 1992, the distillery shut down. The brick buildings, the rickhouses, the copper stills, all silent. The greatest wheated bourbon producer in history gone. It was like watching a cathedral go dark. But the barrels still aging inside? They would one day become the stuff of legend. Legends aren't born during glory. They're born during loss. Japanese distillers entered the unlikely saviors. Here's the twist almost nobody saw coming. While Americans abandoned bourbon, the Japanese embraced it. During the 1970 seconds and 80 seconds, Japanese collectors discovered the beauty of long-aged bourbon, American oak, high-proof releases, pre-prohibition brands, Stitzel Weller, wheated whiskey, unique single-barrel expressions. They bought labels Americans ignored. They bought barrels companies couldn't sell. They bought entire stocks of bourbon left aging with no future in the U.S. Some of the greatest bourbon ever made left the country in shipping containers. And thank God it did, because those bottles helped keep some distilleries solvent. Japan didn't just love bourbon. Japan saved it. This is man. The Beams hold the line. While the industry dipped, the Beam family remained the steady heartbeat of bourbon. Jim Beam White Label stayed affordable, consistent, and widely distributed. It wasn't glamorous, but it was dependable. Beam didn't try to follow vodka trends. They didn't try to reinvent bourbon. They simply made bourbon. That quiet, stubborn consistency kept the category alive long enough for revival to be possible. Years later, Booker No, Jim Beam's grandson, would help start the small batch movement, the spark that lit bourbon's renaissance. But in the dark age, the Beams were simple survivors. 6. Heaven Hill, the quiet collector of orphan brands. Heaven Hill, founded in 1935, became one of the smartest and most resilient companies during bourbon's decline. They bought struggling brands, bought closed distilleries' aging stocks, bought naming rights for abandoned labels, stored millions of barrels in their rickhouses, waited. While others panicked, Heaven Hill collected. That patience would one day make them guardians of some of the most important brands in bourbon history. Maber. The Willets go dormant but not dead. During the decline, the Willet Distillery shut down its distilling operations. But they didn't disappear. They continued bottling and warehousing. They preserved barrels when others dumped them. They kept the land, the buildings, the knowledge. They became a kind of living bourbon archive. Later, when the revival came, Willet would rise in spectacular fashion like a phoenix with purple wax. But in the dark age, they were quiet, still, waiting. In France's, the European market, a second lifeline. While Americans chased vodka and wine coolers, a second unexpected market emerged. Europe. American GIs stationed overseas had introduced bourbon to bars, from Germany to England to Italy. Some European drinkers preferred bourbon to Scotch for its sweetness and boldness. Bourbon's foreign popularity didn't save the industry, but it kept barrels moving and lights on. Sometimes survival isn't triumph. Sometimes survival is simply not quitting. Live, the bottom of the barrel, the lowest point. By the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds, bourbon hit rock bottom. Rickhouses sat empty. Workers were laid off in droves. Many brands were discontinued. Warehouses were demolished. Iconic distilleries were sold for parts. New bourbon drinkers were almost non-existent. Nobody was planning 15 to 20-year whiskey. In 1984, a distiller famously said, "If anyone is aging bourbon more than 8 years today, they're insane. It'll never sell." If only he could see the bourbon aisle now. But this was bourbon's lowest point, its near-death experience. The old families kept working. The warehouses kept breathing. The barrels kept aging. Because even when the world forgets bourbon, bourbon does not forget itself. And deep inside the rickhouses of Kentucky, in the quietest corners, something extraordinary was happening. The whiskey was getting better, much better, older, richer, deeper, more complex than anyone had ever tasted. But nobody knew it yet. Not until a few wild, brilliant, stubborn risk-takers lit a flame that would change everything. Their names? Elmer T. Lee, Booker Noe, Jimmy Russell, Parker Beam, Julian Van Winkle III. Even early collectors in Japan and Europe. These were the ones who would start the bourbon revolution. But revolution requires a spark. And in the next chapter, that spark finally arrives. Chapter 8. The Great Reawakening. If Chapter 7 was the darkness, the long winter where bourbon nearly vanished, then Chapter 8 is the sunrise. Not a sudden burst of light, not a triumphant explosion, but the slow, amber glow of hope creeping into the rickhouses, warming aging barrels that had waited far too long. This is the story of bourbon's rebirth. A rebirth sparked not by massive corporations or marketing budgets, but by a handful of master distillers, visionaries, oddballs, rebels, and believers, men and women, who looked at the dying bourbon industry and saw not ruin, but resurrection. This is the story of the Bourbon Renaissance, one of the most improbable comebacks in American history. In -8, the spark, a quiet idea in Frankfurt. It starts with one man, Elmer T. Lee, an engineer, a World War II veteran, a soft-spoken Kentuckian with a mind full of patience and a palate full of curiosity. Elmer worked at the George T. Stagg Distillery today, Buffalo Trace, a facility with more history than hope. In the early 1982, barrels sat aging with no buyers. Rickhouses were half empty. Production volumes were low. Demand was lower. But Elmer had an idea, one inspired by stories from his mentor, Colonel Albert B. Blanton. Asterisk, asterisk, what if you bottled bourbon from a single barrel, unblended, uncompromised, unsoftened? Asterisk, asterisk. Just the pure expression of one barrel, selected by hand. It was madness. Nobody wanted high-end bourbon. Nobody wanted premium anything from Kentucky in 1984. But bourbon's future has always been shaped by the courageous. Elmer selected a honey barrel from Warehouse H, a metal rickhouse that aged hotter and faster, and bottled it. He named it Blanton's Single Barrel, the first single-barrel bourbon in history. It didn't explode in popularity. It didn't change the world overnight. But it planted the seed, a seed that said, bourbon can be great again. 80. The second spark, Booker Noe's big, bold revolution. If Elmer T. Lee lit the flame, Booker Noe threw gasoline on it. Booker, grandson of Jim Beam, larger than life in every way, wasn't the type of man who tiptoed into anything. He believed bourbon didn't need to be lightened or diluted to compete with vodka. He believed bourbon should taste like bourbon, and so he launched something wild, defiant, and unprecedented. The small batch collection, Booker's Barrel Proof, Bakers's, Knob Creek, Basil Hayden's Botter. Booker's, in particular, was a revelation. Aged long, uncut, unfiltered, loud, unapologetic, raw and honest. Booker released it in the late 1982, just as bourbon was at its lowest point. He told the world, this is how bourbon is supposed to taste. And slowly, people listened. Booker didn't just revive a category. He revived pride. End quote. The third spark of Van Winkle returns. While Elmer and Booker were pushing bourbon forward, another force was pulling history upward from the ashes. His name, Julian Van Winkle III, grandson of Pappy Van Winkle. When Stitzelweller closed in 1992, Julian didn't walk away. He didn't quit. He didn't mourn the past. He gathered every barrel of Stitzelweller wheated bourbon he could find, bottled it selectively, and introduced the world to a name that would one day become mythic. Pappy Van Winkle's Family Reserve. At first, nobody cared. Nobody wanted a 15, 20, or 23-year bourbon. Bars passed. Distributors shrugged. Consumers ignored it. But a small group didn't ignore it. Chefs, writers, collectors, Japanese whiskey enthusiasts, European drinkers, and a few curious American connoisseurs. And slowly, whispers grew. Those whispers would one day become a roar. And the scene 100, Buffalo Trace rises, the new center of gravity. With Elmer's innovations, and later with industry legend Harlan Wheatley guiding the stills, Buffalo Trace began transforming from a nearly forgotten facility into the heart of bourbon's future. They leaned into single barrels, experimental aging, warehouse studies, limited releases, rediscovery of heritage mash bills, massive rickhouse expansions. More innovations followed. Eagle Rare, 10-year Blythe, George T. Stagg, Sazerac Rye, W. L. Weller, Colonel E. H. Taylor Jr. Line, the Antique Collection, and then the partnership. Buffalo Trace plus Julian Van Winkle III, Weller plus Pappy, Wheat plus Barrel Magic. The spark became a flame. Haven sevened. The Willets return a phoenix in purple. In the early 2000s, something remarkable happened. The Willet Distillery turned its stills back on, led by Evan Coulsveen, then by his daughter Britt and son-in-law Drew. Willet began distilling again slowly, carefully, with reverence. They released Willet Family Estate, Rowan's Creek, Noah's Mill, Pure Kentucky Plus, and later, Purple Wax Rye and Bourbon that would become cult classics. In a world just waking up to bourbon again, Willet brought artistry. They became proof that small, independent distilleries could rise again, not by imitating the giants, but by being unapologetically themselves. In fact, the Renaissance goes global. By the late 1992s and early 2000s, the fire spread. Japan celebrated bourbon as an art form. Europe treated it like a rediscovered treasure. American chefs embraced it in the kitchen. Bars began carrying premium brands again. Magazines ran features on the comeback of bourbon. Collectors started hunting bottles. Rye whiskey made its own raging return. Cocktail culture awakened, and bourbon was at the center of it. Suddenly, 10-year bourbon was special. 12-year bourbon was premium. 15-year bourbon was rare. 20-plus-year bourbon was luxury. Barrel-proof releases sold out in minutes. Single barrels became status symbols. Distillery tourism exploded. And in the hills of Kentucky, rickhouses groaned under the weight of soaring demand. Makesable. Craft distilling, the new generation joins the story. Bourbon's rebirth didn't belong only to the old families. A new wave arrived. The craft distillers. Some were hobbyists. Some were chemists. Some were dreamers. Some were stubborn farmers. Some were entrepreneurs with more courage than sense. But together, they expanded bourbon into a national craft movement. In the 1,980 seconds, fewer than 20 legal distilleries operated in the U.S. Today, hundreds. Bourbon became democratic again, not just in Kentucky, but nationwide. Texas, Colorado, New York, California bad, Washington, Utah, Wyoming, Indiana. Some craft whiskey was excellent. Some was ambitious. But all of it contributed to bourbon's modern identity, a spirit that welcomes new voices while respecting old ones. In Fine Nine, the secondary market, a monster is born. With demand skyrocketing and supply limited, something else emerged. The bourbon secondary market. What began as collectors trading bottles turned into auctions, online groups, private sales, astronomical price inflation. Pappy Van Winkle, once unsellable, now moved for $1,000, $2,500, $5,000, $10,000 plus. Weller became unobtainium. BTAC became legend. Store picks became trophies. Single barrels became flex pieces. People camped outside stores, fought over allocations, tracked trucks, mapped distributor routes, built networks of tips and connections. Bourbon went from forgotten to fashionable, and then to frenzy. And yet beneath the frenzy, the whiskey stayed true to itself. The spirit didn't change. Only the world around it did. If we work, the distribution battles craft versus the three-tier system. As bourbon grew, so did the friction. Distributors protected big brands. Craft distillers struggled for shelf space. Allocations became political currency. Bars fought for rare bottles. But these battles also forced transparency. Drinkers became educated. People cared about mash bills, yeast strains, barrel provenance, entry proof, char level, warehouse locations, distillery history. This wasn't drinking. This was passion. And Sepanity, the modern giants, today's titans. By the 2010 seconds, bourbon was a global powerhouse again. The leading titans of the Renaissance: Buffalo Trace, Innovation Engine, Heritage Guardian, Experimental Lab, home of the most sought-after brands on earth, Jim Beam, Beam Suntory, steady as ever, driving small-batch innovation, partnering with Japan, expanding globally, Heaven Hill, quiet powerhouse, guardian of dozens of brands, master of aging and blending, Maker's Mark, Samuel's, crafting soft, weeded magic, and innovating with stave finishing, Willet, artistic, bold, independent, the heart of modern craft, Wild Turkey, Jimmy and Eddie Russell, keeping Kentucky honest with high-proof classics. These families and companies carried bourbon from death to glory and presented Frand, the culture of bourbon, a return to identity. By the 2020 seconds, bourbon wasn't just a drink. It was a hobby, a collection, a lifestyle, a community, a culture, an economy, a culinary pairing, a craft, a legacy, a story. Bourbon tastings became rituals. Bottle hunts became adventures. Store picks became modern folklore. YouTubers, bloggers, and bourbon groups formed tribes. And bourbon became something it had never been before. Personal. People found meaning in it, found friends through it, found stories within it, found themselves reflected in the glass. And that, more than anything, is why bourbon came back. Because bourbon is not a beverage. It's memory, it's history, it's craft, it's courage, it's patience. It's America, flawed, resilient, and forever reaching for something better. In 24, the barrels keep rolling, the future. Even now, the Renaissance continues. New distilleries rise. Old rickhouses expand, wither. Aged stock grows richer. Innovations multiply. Fans grow more passionate way. Global demand intensifies. We are living in the golden age of bourbon. A golden age born from war, its collapse, desperation, patience, innovation, revival, but above all else, heart. Bourbon survived because the people who made it refused to let it die. And the people who drink it now, they honor that survival every time the cork pops and the aroma of oak and history drifts upward. Chapter 9. The Age of Innovation. Bourbon's renaissance didn't stop when the shelves cleared and the world rediscovered its taste for charred oak and patience. It accelerated. It evolved. It expanded beyond anything the old families could have imagined, even in their wildest, most hopeful dreams. What began as a careful revival turned into a full-scale cultural movement, an era defined not by survival, but by creation. The modern bourbon world is not merely a return to form. It is a new creature entirely, wildly experimental, fiercely competitive, unapologetically bold, deeply knowledgeable, historically conscious, technologically advanced, and globally influential. This is the age of innovation, the moment bourbon stepped beyond nostalgia and embraced its future with both hands. A future still rooted in fire, grain, and oak, but shaped by science, ambition, creativity, and the hunger of a new generation. Let's walk into this era, the age of master distillers and mad scientists, heritage giants and restless independents, barrel finishers and yeast whisperers, blending prodigies and tech-driven visionaries. This is bourbon today, and bourbon tomorrow. And Hefteman, the new foundations. Science meets story. For centuries, bourbon was crafted by instinct. A distiller knew a mash was ready by smell, knew a barrel was right by weight, knew a warehouse floor matured fastest by feeling summer heat drift upward. Those instincts are still alive, but now they have partners. Chromatography, microbiology, grain genetics, heat mapping, humidity analysis, stave chemistry, infrared toasting, controlled yeast propagation, barrel entry proof strategy. The industry began documenting what old-timers just knew. And when you mix instinct with science, something extraordinary happens. Bourbon becomes both art and engineering. Distillers now track fermentation curves, yeast ester production, char depth effects, extraction rates, micro-oxygenation, evaporation patterns by warehouse zone. Barrels aren't just filled and forgotten. They're studied. Rickhouses aren't just built. They're designed, and mash bills aren't just recipes. They're formulas with centuries of tradition and modern clarity. The result? A new era of precision bourbon, repeatable, scalable, yet still soulful, is the promise. The rise of finishing a new layer of creativity. Barreling bourbon in charred American oak is law. But finishing it? That's art. Starting in the late 2000s, distillers began exploring secondary finishes with a hunger that bordered on obsession. Suddenly bourbon met port casks, sherry butts, Madeira barrels, cognac casks, rum barrels, French oak, Mizunara oak, stout barrels, Cabernet barrels, vermouth barrels, orange, Curaçao barrels, honey barrels, maple barrels, Amburana. And each finish added new layers: port, deep fruit, plums, richness, sherry, raisin, nuttiness, oxidized sweetness, rum molasses, and tropical warmth. Cognac, creamy luxury and orchard notes. Mizunara, incense, sandalwood, elegance, honey velvet texture, and bright sweetness. Amburana, spice, cinnamon, wild aromatics. Finishing wasn't a gimmick, it became a language, a way for distillers to express identity, a way for new brands to stand out, a way for bourbon to evolve without losing authenticity. Rate, the new generals, modern master distillers. Bourbon's resurgence created new icons, men and women, whose influence rivals that of the founding families. Jimmy and Eddie Russell, Wild Turkey, guardians of bold, high-proof tradition, masters of rye, architects of rare breed. Russell's Reserve, Kentucky Spirit. Harlan Wheatley, Buffalo Trace, scientist, engineer, innovator, the mind behind hundreds of experiments, from Warehouse X to unique mash bills. Drew Kulsveen, $2, blending prodigy, creator of Purple Top Magic, a modern artist with a still. Parker and Craig Beam, Heaven Hill, architects of Elijah Craig Barrel Proof, Larceny, and the rebirth of classic brands. Fred and Freddie No, Beam Suntory, carriers of the Beam lineage into the international era, creators of Booker's, Knob Creek, and the next generation of Beam expressions. Connie Baker and the Craft Innovators, Marianne Eves, Nicole Austin, Lisa Wicker, etc. A new wave of distiller talent bringing fresh perspectives and mastering both chemistry and storytelling. Dan McKee and Brent Elliott, Michter's and Four Roses, minds behind some of the most balanced, elegant bourbons of the era. These distillers are not just making whiskey, they're shaping the palate of the modern world. Isnauyo, the modern giants distilleries that define an era. Buffalo Trace, the innovation engine. No distillery defines the modern bourbon era as dramatically as Buffalo Trace. Projects include Warehouse X, climate-controlled experiment building, the Antique Collection, Blantonzow, Weller's full lineup, Pappy Van Winkle Partnership, Experimental Collection, H&G Warehouse Studies, Single-barrel programs that create cult followings. It is the gravitational center of the bourbon world, for better or worse. Heaven Hill, the quiet powerhouse. Heaven Hill embraced transparency, barrel-proof releases, and classic brands. Elijah Craig Barrel Proof. Larceny Barrel Proof. Henry McKenna, 10 Single Barrel. Heaven Hill Heritage Collection. Parker's Heritage. A distillery rebuilt twice. Committed to quality every step. Beam's Suntory Tradition meets global vision. Beam's global partnerships enabled. International distribution. Collaborations. Experimental releases. Revitalization of classic brands. Booker No's legacy remains alive in every barrel-proof Beam release. Willett the Cult of Craft. Independent. Bold. Distinctive. Their family estate bourbons and ryes became modern treasures. Wild Turkey, the honest bourbon. Jimmy and Eddie Russell kept Turkey exactly what it always was. Bold, high proof, oak forward, authentic. Rare Breed is the bourbon that never compromises. Four Roses, the blend master's dream. With 10 recipes and 2 mash bills, Four Roses created elegant bourbon with unmatched consistency. Michter's, the luxury standard. The rise of limited but exceptional bourbon with perfect balance and elevated aging. Bardstown Bourbon Company, the new blueprint. Perhaps the most important new distillery in modern history. They embraced transparency, blending, sourcing done right, modern architecture, collaboration over secrecy, technology without ego. Discovery Series changed the game, honoring heritage while embracing future blending artistry. Intrepid Day, the rise of blending as art. For decades, blending was considered corporate or industrial. Today, blending is the new frontier of creativity. Blenders like Dixon Dedman, Kentucky Owl, Dan McKee, Andrea Wilson, Michter's, Bardstown Bourbon Co.'s team, Compass Box influenced craft thinkers, Blue Run's Kentucky sake makers turned bourbon designers, independent bottlers like Barrel Craft Spirits turned blending into craft. This wasn't just dumping whiskey together. This was layer building, profile sculpting and tone, finish harmonization, complexity curation, sensory anatomy. Blending became as revered as distilling, sometimes more. 1. The age of the hunt allocations rule the earth. Suddenly. Papillon, Weller, Buffalo Trace, Blanton's Cross, E. H. Taylor, Stag, Old Fitz bottled in Bond decanters places. Parker's Heritage. Four Roses limited editions. Wild Turkey Master's Keep became rare, then scarce, then priceless. Bourbon hunting became a hobby, a sport, an obsession, a community, a universe. People camped outside stores, tracked distributor trucks, built relationships with store owners, traded bottles like baseball cards. Love it or hate it, allocations shaped modern bourbon culture. 8. The bourbon community, a new kind of family. Bourbon evolved from something people drank to something people shared. Meetups, tastings, bottle shares, YouTube channels, podcasts, blogs, masterclasses, Facebook groups, whiskey TikTok, bourbon bars with menus thicker than Bibles. People discussed mash bills class, rickhouse locations, warehouse letters, yeast strains, barrel proof, neck pours, sometimes ridiculously, single barrel variations, collectible labels. This wasn't fandom. This was culture. Bourbon became a bond, a way for strangers to become friends, and friends to become family. The future where bourbon is headed. We now stand at a crossroads. Demand is higher than ever. Distilleries are expanding massively. Craft producers are growing. Aging stock is increasing. Innovation is accelerating. Global markets are exploding. Allocations are tightening. New mash bills are emerging. Technology is reshaping warehouses. And yet the soul of bourbon remains the same. The next frontier will include 1. Advanced aging environments. Controlled humidity, airflow, and heat cycles. 2. sustainable cooperage, oak forest management, alternative staves, regenerative forestry. 3. Yeast innovation, designer strains, wild yeast harvesting, flavor-specific fermentations. 4. Data-driven rickhouse management, sensors, AI modeling, predictive maturation. 5. Ultra-aged bourbons, not rare, intentional. 6. Global bourbon production within U.S. law, more states joining the craft movement. 7. New finishing techniques, layered finishes, sequential finishes, experimental woods. 8. Culinary integration, bourbon and food, food paired to bourbon, bourbon as ingredient and inspiration. 9. Transparency as a defining virtue, consumers demanding honesty about sourcing, aging, mash bills. 10. The inevitable next bourbon boom, already happening. The future of bourbon is bright, but only because its past was dark, only because it nearly died, only because the people who loved it, families, distillers, dreamers, collectors, drinkers, refused to let it fade away. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of bourbon's next century. And somewhere in a quiet rickhouse tonight, a new barrel is aging, unknown, unnoticed, but destined to become part of the legacy. A legacy that started with corn, oak, and stubborn hope, and continues with every glass poured today. Chapter 10. The Spirit That Remembers. A bottle of bourbon is never just a bottle. It is time, held in glass. It is a conversation between past and present. It is a memory of corn that once swayed in a warm Kentucky breeze, water that once flowed through ancient limestone, and oak that once stood tall in an American forest. Bourbon is the physical proof that history can be tasted. But more than that, bourbon is the story of people. People who refused to quit, who believed in craft, who built something that could outlive every storm thrown at it. This chapter isn't a summary. It isn't a conclusion. It is the reflection at the end of a long walk through the rickhouses of time. A reminder that bourbon is not just a spirit in the glass, but a spirit in the world. Let's take that walk. One last time. Slowly, warmly, like sipping a pour that's older than your memories. In attention, the land remembers. Everything in bourbon begins with the land. Kentucky wasn't chosen. It was destined. The limestone water, the fertile soil, the wild American corn, the humid summers, the crisp winters, the oak-filled forests. Before a single still was hammered together, the land already held every ingredient bourbon needed to become itself. The pioneers didn't create bourbon. They discovered it as if it had been waiting there, quietly, for the right hands. And those hands belonged to families who carried their craft like a birthright into 90. The families remember: Beam, Brown, Taylor, Samuels, Weller, Van Winkle, Willett, Pepper, Russell, Noe, and dozens more whose names never made it to labels, but whose sweat seasoned the industry. These families weren't trying to make history. They were trying to make a living. But when you do something with stubborn consistency, generation after generation, history sneaks up on you. Every distillery that stands today is built on the stories of people who endured fires, survived Prohibition Dock, faced bankruptcy worked through war, rebuilt after collapse, waited out the dark ages, believed bourbon would rise again. Bourbon is not the story of success. It is the story of perseverance, enclosed. The barrels remember. A rickhouse holds more than barrels. It holds decades. It holds summers and winters. It holds the laughter of workers on lunch breaks, the clatter of rolling racks, the echo of metal hoops being tightened, the soft creak of wood expanding and contracting. It holds the smell of aging whiskey, sweet, earthy, deep like a ghost that never scares, only comforts. It holds secrets. Barrels talk, not loudly, but they talk. They whisper of their forests, of the fire that charred their insides, of the whiskey they cradle, of the years that pass in silence, shaping something no human hand can rush. A barrel remembers more than we do, and when we pour what it held, It shares those memories with us. In Friends, the fires, remember, look back far enough, and bourbon begins in fire. The fire that cooks the mash, the fire that chars the oak, the fire that once lit up an entire hillside if a moonshiner still ran too hot. The fire in the eyes of distillers who refuse to stop working the craft. Fire is bourbon's oldest teacher, its oldest companion, its oldest danger. And like fire, bourbon has the strange ability to destroy the old while creating the new. History, after all, is not preserved by comfort. It is preserved by the flames we survive. And said, the nation remembers. Bourbon is older than the United States of America. Think about that. Before the Constitution, before the first U.S. president, before the frontier had names on maps, bourbon was already being distilled in the hollows and hills. It grew up with the country. It endured the same wars. It survived the same mistakes. It celebrated the same victories. When America struggled, bourbon struggled. When America rose, bourbon rose. The spirit and the nation are intertwined, bound by the same themes: ingenuity, resilience, reinvention, hope. To drink bourbon is to drink the story of America itself. In Netzwanner, the fall remembered why the Dark Ages matter. No bourbon lover today can fully appreciate a pour without knowing it almost disappeared. We forget that. Rickhouses were abandoned. Barrels were dumped. Distilleries shuttered. Families lost the craft. Demand went to zero. Bourbon became a joke. But bourbon remembers. The industry carries its scars with pride. Every distiller knows Prohibition wasn't the only near-death experience. The 1,970 seconds, 80 seconds, collapse, hurt deeper, lingered longer, and came closer to killing bourbon than anything before or since. And yet that collapse taught bourbon one of its most important lessons. Asterisk, asterisk. When you forget who you are, you disappear. When you return to who you are, you rise. Asterisk, asterisk. That lesson is why the Renaissance happened. That lesson is why the modern era thrives. That lesson is why bourbon will never fade again. Intent. The revival remembered the spirit that refused to die. Bourbon's rebirth wasn't an accident. It was built by Elmer T. Lee's creativity, Booker Noe's boldness, Jimmy and Eddie Russell's constancy, Parker Beam's stewardship pawnee, Harlan Wheatley's innovation, Drew Colesvine's artistry, the Samuels family's reinvention, Julian Van Winkle III's loyalty to heritage use, the global drinkers who believed in American whiskey before Americans did bing, the craft distilleries that refused to accept limitations crimes, the collectors, enthusiasts, bloggers, bartenders, and everyday sippers who turned bourbon into culture. This was a revival created not by chance, but by love. Bourbon didn't just come back. Bourbon was brought back by hands that wouldn't let go, by palates that demanded more, by hearts that knew bourbon was worth saving. End quote. The community remembers. Bourbon today isn't just made in rickhouses. It's made in conversations, at tastings, at bottle shares, at distillery tours, around fire pits, at kitchen tables, in backyards, on YouTube channels, in online groups, at bars where a bartender remembers your favorite pour. Bourbon is no longer a solitary drink. It's a communal one. It invites connection, invites storytelling, invites new friendships, invites meaning, and the community doesn't forget. Not the good bottles, not the rare moments, not the history, not the people who poured the glasses. In Fortnite, the spirit remembers what bourbon really is. Bourbon is not alcohol. Bourbon is patience years in a barrel, craft generations of expertise, heritage families who refuse to quit, fire transformation through heat, time seasons layered into flavor, hope that the future will appreciate what the past created. You're not just tasting oak, caramel, tobacco, vanilla, cherry, or spice. You're tasting the beam stills that lit in 1795, the limestone springs that fed frontier farms, The first barrels floated to New Orleans. The bottled in bond act, the courage of the families who survived Prohibition. The dusty barrels nobody wanted in the 1,980 seconds. The first single barrel of Blanton's B. The first Booker's batch. The rediscovery of Pappy 4. The rise of Willet. The explosion of modern bourbon culture. You're tasting America's memory. And every sip reminds you that the spirit is alive. It lives in the glass. It lives in the rickhouse. It lives in the land. It lives in the people. It lives in you. In Wise. The final pour, why bourbon endures. Bourbon endures because it is honest. It doesn't hide behind additives, doesn't rush maturity, doesn't apologize for boldness, doesn't pretend to be anything other than what time makes it. Bourbon is the spirit that refuses to forget where it came from. It remembers. The land, the families, the barrels, the fires, the falls, the rebirth, the community. It remembers all of it and carries it forward. And as long as people gather, pour glasses, tell stories, and share moments, bourbon will live. Not because it is popular, not because it is collectible, not because it is fashionable. Bourbon will live because it means something. It is American courage in a bottle. American resilience, aged in oak. American memory made warm. And when the cork pops, when the aroma rises, when the first sip hits your tongue, you're not just drinking bourbon, you're participating in a 250-year story that is still being written. A story older than the flag. A story stronger than the storms. A story made by hands that believed in craft, family, patience, and fire. A story that will outlive all of us. Because bourbon endures. Bourbon remembers. And bourbon, like the people who make it, never stops rising. Chapter 11. Tomorrow's Whiskey. The future of bourbon and the philosophy of tasting. Every bourbon story up to this point has been history. The land, the families, the aging, the rise, the fall, the rebirth. But bourbon is not finished. The spirit is still evolving, still becoming, still whispering its next chapters in the darkness of rickhouses across the country. This chapter looks forward through the heat waves of summer aging, through the quiet winters where barrels contract, through the decisions of distillers not yet born. And then, when the future feels within reach, we'll step back inward into the glass to explore the philosophy of tasting. Not how bourbon tastes, but why it tastes, and what it means to truly know it. This is the final arc of the book, a meditation on what bourbon will become and how we, as drinkers, should listen to it. This Distillable, Part I. The future of bourbon. The next era. When tradition meets possibility. Bourbon has always lived in tension. Old versus new. Tradition versus innovation. Patience versus impatience. Instinct versus science. Heritage versus experimentation. That tension creates magic. And the magic is only getting stronger. Here is where bourbon is headed. In 2. 1. The new age of rickhouses' climate-controlled aging. For the first time in 250 years, distillers are beginning to control humidity, airflow, temperature, barometric pressure, heat cycles, not to cheat time but to shape it. Warehouse X at Buffalo Trace, a living laboratory. Climate experiments that will dictate the future of high-end aging. Bardstown Bourbon Company, temperature-zoned rickhouses that mature barrels with intention. Craft operations across the country, testing microclimates, alternative warehouse builds, elevation effects, geothermal heat, and more. Prediction. The next revolution in bourbon flavor will come not from mash bills, but from warehouses. And 2. Oak. The new frontier. White oak is bourbon's partner, but the world's forests are changing. Distillers are responding, planting their own oak forests, experimenting with faster-growing hybrids, curing staves longer, toasting with precision, introducing exotic woods outside the primary aging, legally, researching sustainable growth to secure bourbon's next century. Prediction. Cooperage will become as famous as distilleries. Barrels will be named, celebrated, collected, remin. 3. Yeast innovation, the quiet revolution. Yeast has always been the heartbeat of bourbon flavor. Now, it's becoming a symphony. Modern distillers are isolating historic strains, mapping flavor esters, hybridizing new yeast families, cultivating wild yeast from forests, fields, and farms, exploring yeast terroir, a concept once exclusive to wine. Prediction: within 20 years, yeast strains will be the focus of high-end bourbon lines like mash bills are today. In fact, 4. Fermentation. Longer, wilder, more expressive. Short fermentations produce efficiency. Long fermentations produce soul. The industry is rediscovering the magic of time. 5-day ferments, 7-day ferments, open-air wild fermentations, microbial layering techniques, enhanced ester creation, controlled bacterial involvement. Prediction: fermentation will be where the next generation of craft distillers makes their name. Lecture 5. Blending will become its own genre. Blending used to be seen as compromise. Now it is art. And the next era will include master blenders as celebrities, limited blends composed like symphonies, annual series based on blending philosophy, cross-distillery collaborations, multi-state terroir blends, high-proof blend showcases, vertical blending of barrels from the same rickhouse stack. Prediction: blending-focused brands like Bardstown Bourbon Company, Barrel Craft Spirits, and High West will reshape the landscape when the backed. 6. Finishing, the infinite game. Finishing started as curiosity. It has become a language. The future will include triple finishing, sequential finishing, barrel, 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 hybrid wood casks, stave matrices, finishing inspired by food science, co-fermented barrel finishes fruits, honey, spices, flavor echo, finishing matching cask, finishes to inherent bourbon notes. Prediction: finishes will become as structured as wine styles. Expect bourbon regions defined by finishing tendencies. Its pros. 7. Craft distilling, the new voices. Craft distillers are doing what the big houses can't, taking risks, distilling wild mash bills, innovating with local grains, exploring heirloom corns, embracing terroir, creating young but expressive whiskey. Distilleries like Wilderness Trail, New Riffley, Garrison Brothers, Smoke Wagon, Balcones, Starlight, and Few, Frey Ranch, Kings County Rive are shaping a new era. Prediction: craft whiskey will produce the next legendary distiller, someone whose name will sit beside Beam, Van Winkle, Samuels, and Russell. Many. 8. The global bourbon drinkers, the new guardians. The next bourbon boom isn't American. It's global. Japan, South Korea, Germany, Australia, France, Italy, Taiwan. These markets are wild for bourbon, not just premium bottles, but craft expressions, single barrels, and barrel-proof releases. Prediction: the world will shape bourbon's future just as much as Kentucky does. 18. 9. The return of patience. In the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds, nobody aged bourbon past 8 years. Today, people fight over 18, 23, and even 25-year bottles. But in the future, distillers will once again rediscover patience, not for rarity, for flavor. Prediction: we will see unprecedented aging programs, 30 years, 40 years, even experimental century-long aging programs controlled by technology. Time will become the ultimate luxury. The One Now, Part II, the philosophy of tasting. Tasting bourbon is not about identifying notes, proving knowledge, showing off, chasing hype, impressing anyone. Tasting bourbon is a philosophy, a practice, a conversation between senses and soul. Here is the Bourbon on the Brain philosophy of how to truly taste whiskey. Number 4. 1. Taste for yourself, not for the label. A bourbon collector has two palates: the real one, the one influenced by hyper, The real one matters. Taste blind often. Taste with humility. Taste without chasing someone else's ranking. A well-loved $40 bottle can resonate more deeply than a flipper-controlled $800 bottle. The bottle does not create the experience. You do. 8. 2. Tasting begins before the pour. The ritual matters. The feel of the cork, the slow tilt of the bottle, the amber ribbon falling into the glass, the aromatics rising before the first swirl. These moments prepare your senses. They center you. Bourbon is a sensory event, not just a drink. In Portside. 3. Nose the spirit like a story. Don't jam your nose into the glass. Bourbon teaches softly. Hover. Let the aromatics rise. Listen with your senses. Ask the whiskey what it wants to say. Is it warm? Is it bold? Is it shy? Is it fruit-forward? Is it oak-heavy? Is it spicy? Is it sweet? This is the first conversation. Enders. 4. The first sip is not the truth. The first sip is the handshake. The second is the introduction. The third is the truth. Let your palate acclimate. Let the heat settle. Let the flavors open. Never judge a bourbon on the first swallow. Was not. 5. Explore the whiskey's journey. Taste not for flavor notes, but for movement. Where does it begin? Honey? Heat? Grain? Fruit? Spice? Where does it travel? Mid-palate bloom. Barrel sweetness. Rye tingle. Viscous texture. Where does it end? Long finish? Short and clean? Drying oak? Toasted sugar? The journey is the experience. When 10. 6. Water is not cheating, it is translation. A drop of water opens aromatics, softens edges, reveals hidden layers, reduces alcohol suppression of esters. Quote, if you want to know a bourbon's soul, taste it neat. If you want to learn its secrets, add water. And 21. 7. The best bourbon is the one shared. You can drink bourbon alone, but you experience bourbon with others. A bottle shared among friends is amplified, expanded, deepened. Flavor is memory. Memory is flavor. A pour with friends tastes better not because of the whiskey, but because of the people, his faces. 8. Some bottles are meant for the shelf, most are meant for the glass. Collector culture forgets this. A bottle unopened is potential. A bottle opened is joy. Don't hoard experiences. Don't wait for a perfect moment. Pour the good bottles on good nights. Perfection isn't a date. Perfection is the moment someone says, "Damn, that's good," and you nod, knowing you made the right choice. End 2. 9. Bourbon doesn't just taste like flavors. It tastes like time. When you sip bourbon, you're tasting. The season it was barreled, the warehouse it slept in, the summers that warmed it, man, the winters that tightened it, the angels that sipped from it, the workers who rolled the barrel, the family who distilled it, the land that birthed it chapped. You're tasting time, and time tastes good. And the final ideas why the future matters. Bourbon's future is bright not because of hype, but because bourbon is evolving into the best version of itself. History preserved, craft respected, innovation embraced in descend, community growing, palates expanding, transparency increasing, quality rising, global love spreading. Bourbon has always remembered where it came from. Now it is discovering where it is going. And we, you, me, everyone who pours a glass with intention are part of that journey. We are shaping the future of bourbon with every bottle we buy, every pour we share, every story we tell, every conversation at a bourbon table. This is the greatest era bourbon has ever known. But the greatest era is never the final one. Because bourbon is still becoming, still evolving, still teaching, still inspiring, still waiting patiently in rickhouses, whispering, there is more to come, and there always will be.